What is fair trade? Boy, we could talk for an hour about what fair trade is. I'll try to summarize as quickly as I can. Generally and broadly speaking, fair trade is the international multi-stakeholder nonprofit organization that is behind the fair trade label or mark, which is currently the most globally recognized by consumers and industries ethical mark, ethical trading label in the world. Now, what that means is that we work with currently over 1,700 producer organizations, which represent nearly 2 million smallholder farmers and workers. We work in 73 countries. I guess you could describe us as a federation of stakeholders that operate around a core set of shared values and principles. And what that means is that we have, of course, those producer networks, which operate in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and work with those cooperatives that have their own membership. And then we also have over 20 what we call national fair trade organizations, which are more or less the market-facing organizations in individual countries or regions, such as Fair Trade Foundation in the UK, or Fair Trade America, Fair Trade Italy, Fair Trade Canada, etc. And we also, our partner organization, our sister organization, FlowCert, is probably the leading global certification body. And what they do is do the certifications and audits on the ground. And those audits include things like, of course, things like environmental standards and codes of conduct, and they verify sales numbers and all of those kinds of things. Well, I'm not sure which tin you're referring to. So we have a number of licensees and different coffee companies that all embrace the same shared values as everyone else, but how they interpret those on their packaging is totally up to them. So all I can do is speak to, I guess basically what you're asking is, does fair trade walk the talk? And, having been part of the industry, both on the commercial sector and development sector, I guess one of the main reasons that I joined Fair Trade is because I think that it is the largest organization in the world to affect change in the coffee industry. How it does that is through a variety of different ways. As I said, we have a group of standards around labor practices, access to education, gender rights, child and forced labor, of course, environmental standards, things like that. But I think the thing that everyone sort of knows fair trade for is the minimum price. And the Fair Trade minimum price was established to provide a safety net to farmers during times of depressed coffee prices, or if there's a natural disaster or plant disease, anything that's affecting the price of coffee, gives them this economic safety net, and it's gauged around the average cost of sustainable production in the world today. So it sort of acts as an insurance policy for farmers. Well, again, that's the cornerstone of fair trade. It's pretty much there in our name, fair trade. We're not asking for charity for farmers or a handout. We're just asking for an equal shake, a fair shake. I think that, again, the way that we support farmers is through the fair trade minimum price and the social premium, and then there's another premium on top of that for organic farmers. I would say the vast majority of fair trade coffee is also sold with the dual certification of organic. So right now, all of those things added up equal $1.90 for the minimum price, if all of those things are in play. Right now, the world price of coffee set on the commodity exchange, and we could talk about that for an hour because it's a very So, but right now the C price for coffee trading in September is below $1. So we're already almost twice what the price is. So the whole idea of fair trade is, again, to create this safety net for farmers so that they're able to engage in a lot of these other sorts of initiatives that they're being asked to do regarding education, regarding preservation of the environment, etc. But the premise of fair trade is that unless farmers can see and actually realize that coffee farming is a viable business, then anything else that follows in terms of farmer support or any of these other initiatives is somewhat going to fall on deaf ears because farmers can't put food on their table. And this has become sort of a common phrase, but think about that. Farmers can't put food on their table. So what we're trying to do is, through these fair trading practices, and again, these are not something, the standards and practices are not something which have been devised in an ivory tower in New York or London or Paris or Berlin. Farmers, the unique thing about the fair trade system is that farmers have equal representation with every other stakeholder. They're on our board of directors, they're active in all of the management decisions. So these are practices and standards that are devised and agreed upon by all stakeholders. Now, apart from that, since the onset of COVID-19, which has put, increased pressure on farmers who are already enduring a 2-year price crisis. There was a figure that I ran across recently by a leading multinational corporation that more than 60% of farmers in the 2018-2019 harvest season sold their coffee at below the cost of production. 60%. So we're not talking about just ethical trading anymore. We're talking about an existential crisis for the coffee industry itself. How long is that sustainable just from a purely business model? So now on top of that, we have COVID-19. And what Fair Trade did is immediately establish 2 funds. One for the purchase of personal protective equipment for mill workers, farmers, cooperative management, PPEs, exactly, right. And also emergency food packages. The other fund was established to continue and also in some cases initiate new programs that could help to build the capacity and resilience of cooperatives to meet the unanticipated impacts, because no one really knows how long this is going to go on and what the impacts are going to be. Well, we've been very active in living income. We started the program several years ago in cocoa, and it involves a lot of data gathering and data analysis. In cocoa, it was slightly easier, well, I wouldn't say slightly, much easier than the coffee sector because of the nature of the fair trade supply chain. We really source most of the fair trade cocoa from 2 countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So we were able to do studies there and found that even fair trade certified farmers, 58% of them were living at below the poverty line. So you can imagine what non-certified farmers were living like. So we started working with companies and also the governments to address this issue, and it resulted in a raising of the Fairtrade minimum price and also the national prices by the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, we started Living Income in Coffee in 2019. We're still in the process of gathering data. But I think the most important aspect of Living Income is that for organizations like us, and Fairtrade certainly isn't the only one engaged in Living Income, but I think that our system and analysis and how the different data points that we're gathering is perhaps more robust than others, because a lot of the Living Income studies are based around purely the sustainable cost of production, but we realize that a farming family needs a lot more than that to reach the standard of living. But I think that the important thing is organizations like ours can do all the data gathering and come up with what the target looks like for a decent standard of living, what a real living income would look like. And it's going to be different in every country. It's going to look different in Santa Marta, Colombia, than it does in Ethiopia, for example. So we can define what that target looks like, but the other two parts of this pyramid are engagement with commercial partners and governments to advocate for living income pricing within food supply chains. And so we've been engaged in that on many different fronts. In January of this past year, we hosted a Living Income Forum in Utrecht, where we invited 50 companies from the EU to participate and ask the question and engage with them around, is this really viable? We can set the target, but are you going to be able to integrate this into your current business models? So yes, living income is very important to Fairtrade, and I think to the viability of the coffee industry itself going forward. We don't certify individual farmers. Our model is based on working with cooperatives and building the resilience of cooperatives to meet the needs of their members. We only work with democratically run cooperatives, so leaders have a say. Members have a say in the leadership and the management, and also workers have the right of collective bargaining. So in terms of, does the money pass directly to farmers? It does, because they vote on how those funds are going to be used. Now, in the case of COVID-19, before, a certain percentage of the premium was mandated to be used for quality and yield improvements. But in light of the economic impacts and difficulties around internal movement and logistics and just being able to sell coffee, we have granted the cooperatives the ability to use the totality of the premium as they best see fit, which in some cases result in direct payments to farmers. It could be anything from infrastructure to buying computers to taking on additional staff to engaging in workshops around price risk management or quality improvement. The list goes on and on. Yeah, so we represent the farmers in the same way that the cooperatives represent the farmers. And we trust in the cooperatives to meet the needs of their farmers according to whatever the local circumstances command and demand. We do have an auditing system. FlowCert audits the use of the premium, and it's reflected in our annual impact reports. . Well, I don't know what sustainability means anymore. I really don't. I just hosted a webinar on this that went an hour and a half with different members of the coffee industry asking this very question, because when sustainability started to be used in the coffee industry back in the late 70s and 80s, it was used to define kind of an environmental stewardship program. And now it's expanded to include child and forced labor, deforestation, gender rights, water conservation, access to education. The list goes on and on. And I think that all of those are really, really important initiatives, but I think that one of the challenges for the coffee industry is, how do we prioritize them? Is it necessary to prioritize them? How do we, is all of the above okay? Or how do we strategically start to address these as a common community so that we can actually have impact? And I think that one of the things that we need to start with is having more concerted conversations with producers themselves and producers groups to identify what their priorities are versus our priorities. I think also, one of the reasons that sustainability is starting to become a muddy term is that, you know, an individual cafe or a company can screw in an LED light bulb and it becomes a sustainability project. So, I think that we while we want to embrace all of these initiatives, and I think that they're all important, I think that we need to prioritize them. So, how does Fairtrade define sustainability? For me, it's making sure that all members of a supply chain, and here I'm going to digress for just a minute, because I think that language is very, very important in the coffee industry. We use very specific language in the trading of coffee. We use very specific language and descriptors in cupping coffee. But when we use the term supply chain, it immediately creates this image which is hierarchical and transactional in nature. And I think that maybe a better use or a better way to describe this community of common stakeholders is a coffee circle. And that or a supply circle, if everybody around the circle has their needs met, then that's sustainable. So, I think that in order for the coffee industry to move forward, we have to sort of change the framework of how we are looking at this very, very complicated relationship between producer all the way to consumer. And so fair trade looks to create integrity in trading and making sure that everyone has their basic economic needs met, but also that there are principles and standards included around sustainability and labor rights and things like that. I wish we had that lever to pull. Yeah, I mean, we are a voice in the wilderness calling for reason. But, I think that this pandemic has created so much uncertainty in the world that we're seeing a lot of different reactions. Now, we're seeing some countries, some producing countries that have internal restrictions around movement, which are preventing them from harvesting the coffee in some cases, and in some cases affecting mill operations, and in other cases affecting the movement to ports. So, if I were I used to be a coffee trader, my job is to manage risk. So I would want to make sure to get as much coffee out of those regions as I could in order to meet my customer demands. Now, on the other hand, I've maintained some good contacts with the trading community, and conversations I've had with them is that because of the chaotic effect that COVID-19 has had on what we call the out-of-home sector, which is cafes and restaurants and office coffee services, that's collapsed by around 90%. And not just in North America, but in the EU and Asia. Now, some of those are starting to come back online, but people are revisiting, is it really necessary for everybody to come back to the office? Have we now become accustomed to a new way of working from home? And are people just as, if not more productive? So a lot of the traders are trying to balance the contracts that they have in place and being able to deliver those on those contracts, but also seeing decreased demand from roasters because these usual outlets are now closed and no one knows how long this is going to go on. So I think that there are a lot of different approaches and strategies toward dealing with this. And on the one hand, people are stockpiling, and on the other hand, people are barely bringing in anything because they don't want to bear that financial risk. Well, I think that there are two questions inherent in your comments there. One is a comment about the Fairtrade system, and the other is a sort of a question about the ethical trading practice of the global coffee system, right? So in terms of the Fairtrade minimum price, I have a slight correction. The Fairtrade minimum price is not designed to guarantee sustainable livelihoods for farmers. It's again this economic safety net that's tied to the cost of production, so that at least they can meet the cost of production. Living income, the Fairtrade living income reference price that we're aiming for, addresses the livelihood question. In terms of criticism, I would say that any organization that is as public and as international as Fairtrade is going to attract criticism. Even Mother Teresa had her detractors, right? Right. The difference with us, I think, and not as opposed to Mother Teresa, I'm not suggesting this, but is that we welcome criticism because we think that we realize that Fairtrade is not a perfect system. It is constantly evolving to meet the changing needs of producers, traders, roasters, and retailers. And so we welcome criticism, but we're also asking those critics to help us make it better. And in terms of misuse of the premium, I guess I would ask those people who talk about misuse of the premium as according to who? Because again, we're empowering cooperatives to make those decisions. For example, here in the United States, around this time of year, people are expecting their tax returns, right? And some of those people currently are probably on unemployment. So do we then expect them to be mandated to use that tax return in a specific way? Otherwise, it's a misuse. Similarly, when we're talking about sustainable supply circles, I think that it has to work all the way around the circle. Having been part of this coffee industry for so many years, I get tired of sustainability initiatives ending at the shore of consuming countries, as if all sustainable practices are the onus of producers and everyone in producing countries. If we're really talking about a sustainable supply circle, then we have to also take a hard look at our own practices around labor rights, around energy usage, around the kind of waste that we're generating because we're members of the coffee community. So I guess, in terms of the global coffee system and how we address that, I think that that's one of the goals of fair trade for a long time. But I think we also have to look at the source of why there may potentially be problems in the supply circle. The coffee exchange and the coffee commodities system was set up many years ago by people in the global north to provide more value to people at, let's say, the wider end of the supply circle. And it's sort of based on old economic theory about extracting value from global south and delivering it to the global north. And in terms of coffee trading, all of the price risk management tools and financial levers are in the hands of people in the global north. Farmers can't participate in that. And so if you're a farmer and you're, I think we also have to remember that farmers get one paycheck a year. One paycheck. So now you have to meet the cost of your production, all the inputs, you have to pay the school fees, you have to put money aside for rainy days, you have to anticipate what your food needs are, what your medical bills might be, all of that. So I think that we have to look at how coffee is bought and sold. And I think that if we take a hard look at it, the current manner in which it's traded is both ethically and economically unsustainable. And I think we're in a golden period right now because of COVID-19, because it gives us an opportunity to hit the reset button, to pause. And so many of us are looking at ways of how we've spent time or practices that we've engaged in and are trying to come up with new ways of doing things. And I think that the coffee industry has a golden opportunity here. We have an inflection point where we can really make a difference. Well, I think that, this is, I've talked about this a little bit in different interviews and webinars that I've had, is that whenever a crisis appears, whether it's a health crisis, an environmental crisis, the coffee price crisis, and now the pandemic, our first reflex as human beings is to reach backwards, to go, we need to reestablish what we knew as normal, because we know how to navigate those waters. We know who we are in those waters. We know what our identity is, and we know who our tribe members are. But some of the same, if we go back to the old practices that brought us to this crisis, we're just going to be delaying and delaying and delaying the solution that's going to get us out of this cycle. So I think that it's an opportunity, again, to really reflect on what brought us here, what opportunities lie ahead, and how we can make positive changes for the future. Well, I think exploitation is really the key word here, because I think that we can nibble around the edges, and a lot of times fair trade is identified solely with the fair trade minimum price, which is addressing financial, economic exploitation by the system. But I think that what we need to do is start to address exploitation in all its forms, whether it's environmental, whether it's social, whether it's gender-based, educational exploitation, but lack of access to education for certain groups. So I think that, child and forced labor is something that's very serious in producing countries, and fair trade takes it very seriously. And I think the risk is that everyone is looking for an absolutely clear supply chain that has no forced labor or child labor in it. And I think that that's admirable, but I think it may be unachievable. And the more important thing is to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to address these issues rapidly. to analyze them, investigate them, and then address them through remediation measures, so that the community itself learns what the consequences of these practices are, both in terms of their trading partners, but also the impact that it has on their own community. But again, I have to go back to what is the root cause of these problems, and it comes down to exploitation. So, for instance, in the last 2 years, we've gone through another cycle of coffee price crisis. It isn't the first time. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we had similar crises. And if you go back and you look at all of the white papers and all of the studies and all of the forums that tried to address this, you could copy paste them. We're doing almost the exact same thing right now. So when we look at child labor and forced labor and the increase of women being engaged in agricultural labor, it's mostly because they're the most readily available labor at hand. So if you're a smallholder farmer and you can't meet the cost of production, you can't afford to hire temporary labor to help you with the harvest. So what do? You bring your kids in and you engage your family members. And this has, a cascading domino effect of impacts. Women are now taken out of the usual sort of social context and out in the fields where they're removed from, the eyes of the rest of society. They're vulnerable. Kids are taken out of schools. So I think that, again, we have to look at how coffee is bought and sold, and rather than looking at the symptoms, look at the causes for a lot of these problems, which are systemic across not only coffee but many commodities. Yeah, I mean, you're so correct that this is a global problem, and it's important for all of us to realize that no single company, NGO, government is going to be able to tackle this or come up with the perfect solution all on their own. It's going to take collaborative effort from a whole group of people. And again, it's a matter of looking at exploitation. In this case, exploitation of the environment, based on our usual systems of trade, based on how industry interacts and defines its relationship with the environment. And so I think that while there are these individual groups that are trying to build awareness around these issues, and in some cases creating strategies to help deal with it, it's going to take more and more conversation and recognition on a global level. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that, I'm right now in the US and I'm an American citizen. And, America has probably done less than anybody, especially in the last 3 years, to address this very, very important topic. So, I think that Fairtrade's core strength is this interconnected network of stakeholders between the producers, the cooperatives, the producer networks, the national fair trade organizations, and Fairtrade International itself. So we're really prepared and I guess structured to help to affect change on a global level very quickly once answers become available, but the answers aren't coming. So what we're trying to do is partner with a whole host of different international organizations to help farmers prepare it used to be mitigation and adaptation, and now I think that everyone's really talking about adaptation. Climate change is here to stay for the foreseeable future, and so how do we prepare for it? Again, we think that the core strength of Fairtrade is around the economic viability of producer communities, and unless they can actually make a decent living, they're going to be ill-prepared to tackle any of these sorts of issues in a really, really constructive way. And I guess we, fundamentally, we have to reframe our relationships to the environment, the economy, transportation, and world trade. And we can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results, or expect that that they will eventually solve this problem for us. Because who is the they? It's us. It comes down to us. So I think that it takes individual action, but also collaborative effort. Well, you've just that's sort of the definition of why fair trade exists, is to create those kind of ethical and sustainable systems of trade in the context of globalization. I think that one of the ways that we do it, of course, is through the mechanisms that we have in place, through the premium and through the fair trade minimum price. We also provide a lot of producer services and producer support programs around issues of financial literacy and helping to build the capacity of cooperatives to really meet the challenges of globalization and act as viable business partners rather than just being recipients of bad trade practices, to actually increase their ability to negotiate and to interact on the global stage. I think one of the things that is starting to evolve in these conversations around globalization and sustainability have to do with transparency. And I think that is a great first step towards sustainability. And you're starting to see certain mandates and now regulations around sustainable supply chains for food products that are being introduced in governments, primarily in the EU. Last year, I gave a presentation to the German Parliament on some of these issues around global trade. But I think that there's also a danger in some of these emerging new technologies, such as blockchain. And I'm a huge advocate of blockchain, but blockchain has to be a two-way street. It can't be another form of extraction. In other words, it can't be, now we're asking for farmers and cooperatives to give us all of this data. The beauty of blockchain is that it creates a channel of communication and information sharing that can go both ways. So a farmer can see how his or her coffee gains or decreases in value as it goes through that system, and that gives them more negotiating power going forward. But I think that there's also a false equivalency between transparency and sustainability. Just because you can see where your coffee or your bananas or your sugar comes from doesn't necessarily mean that it was produced sustainably. So I think that we need to add in that kind of information to make sure and to have it third-party certified. So I think that this is possibly the future of fair trade, is to engage in these new technologies to create a greater depth of knowledge between buyers and sellers, but also having it third-party certified so that people know that there's integrity in those trading systems. So again, the standards are developed in collaboration with all stakeholders, and really are based around core principles of shared value. Again, some of those things, if a cooperative is interested in becoming Fairtrade certified, there's an application process that they can go through FlowCert, and then they have to meet certain criteria at the very beginning, such as they have to be a democratically run cooperative. They have to, represent their members. They have to be able to demonstrate that they have the capacity to increase the financial literacy and administration of their cooperative. There are environmental standards, there are labor standards that have to be met. There's a whole list that you can find on our website. I think one of the challenges right now, which we're trying to meet in Fairtrade, is that because of this long period of depressed prices in coffee, we're starting to see more and more cooperatives apply for Fairtrade certification, because the idea is, well, if I can get Fairtrade certification, then automatically I'm going to be getting a much higher price for my coffee. And what ends up happening is that they don't sell the anticipated amount of Fairtrade coffee because they haven't really developed any market access. They're just expecting that their buyers will somehow also become Fairtrade certified, or be interested in buying that same coffee under the Fairtrade certified mark. And so we have recently changed our standards for cooperatives to enter into the system for both coffee and cocoa. And they have to demonstrate that they do have market access, that they are going to be able to provide new buyers into the system, and not just be competitors with other cooperatives that are already certified in their same region. There's a variety of different standards for producers, there's standards for traders, there's standards for roasters and retailers. And again, all of those have been derived from consultations. And I would say, these standards are constantly under revision. Right now, we're undergoing our coffee standard review. We're in the second round of consultation. This takes between 18 months and 2 years to really get all the consultation and say, okay, how can we improve the standards to meet the current conditions, but not create extra burdens for any of the stakeholders, right? So that's sort of a tricky balance of, we're trying to simplify the standards, make them much more clear, much less burdensome, but also increase their impact and effectiveness. Well, I think, it depends upon, I guess I don't know how to answer that question. So for somebody, a cooperative that is just entering the system who does not have this market access, of course, these costs are borne upfront to become certified. And the reason that there's a cost associated with it is because there's a variety of reasons. But one is that unless farmers have skin in the game, there's very little incentive for them to meet the standards, right? So that they are active members of the system, participating in the system, and not just beneficiaries. If those costs could be assumed by their buyers, that would be ideal. So far, we've seen little appetite for that. So if you look at somebody who has just entered the system, and you weigh the cost of certification and the and the process of having to report and have those audits, of course, the burden is going to seem much more extreme when you weigh it against the benefits that they're deriving from fair trade sales. Now, if you look at cooperatives that have been members in the system for 5 years, the cost and burden of that membership within the system is infinitesimal when you compare it to the multiple benefits. Boy, I get asked that a lot, especially these days. And I think that everyone's crystal ball is a little bit fuzzy right now in terms of what the future is going to look like. What I can say is that while we don't know what the impacts of COVID-19 are going to be, especially on the health of producing countries and consuming countries, and the effect it's going to have on the global economy, we do know that at some point in the future, we will reach a new normal. And within that new normal, coffee will be grown and coffee will be drunk. What happens in between, it's anybody's guess.